everyone, welcome to Vickie Skorji, to the first interview for Thrive in Japan, a Japanese community of internationals who not just want to exist, but actively thrive. So TELL is the short for Tokyo English Lifeline and has been helping the international community in Japan since 1973. That's 45 years of active helping to the internationals in need of not just help with mental health, but also with varieties of types of information and daily needs in Japan. So thank you so much for coming, Vickie.
Thank you very much, Dora, for inviting me today and for making me one of your inaugural speakers.
Yes, I feel very honored because I really admired all the things that you've done with TELL and the way you are leading the segment of the organization. So,
thank you, but I think I'm just one person of many. TELL has a long history of, as you mentioned, of being there, and it's very much about all of the volunteers and all of the people. So I'm just one process in a very special organization.
What I really like about TELL is that, it's trying to bring this community spirit, but maybe a lot of people don't know enough about TELL yet. So could you tell us more about it, please?
Well, thank you. But I think the other part of it is people in Japan are coming and going all the time. So there's always new people that want to know about this information and resources, and people that had that knowledge, but they leave, and so it's not passed on. So it's like a constant thing that happens when you're dealing with the foreign population, right? So thank you. As you mentioned, we've been around for 45 years. We grew out of the Japanese Lifeline, inaugural, and what they noticed when they started was that there was a huge requirement in the foreign community for the foreigners who were desperate to find out information and support services. So if you thought about it in 1973, that's a time before the internet, time before we're doing things like this. So how would you find out, where you could find medical services or legal services? I mean, everything's okay. You're doing okay in your time overseas until something goes wrong, right? And life is always about things going up and down, right? Life is never, if you like, always peachy or going well, right? It's always got its ups and downs, and it's always got its stresses. And if you come here with family members as well, chances are that one of you is going to be having an issue at some point. So how did you find these things out? It was really difficult. There wasn't a telephone directory you could go to. The internet didn't help you. So you were really desperate for those sorts of resources and supports. So when we first started, we had so many people asking us for information requests. How do I get a lawyer? Where do I find a doctor? I can't even find large shoes. I need specialist food. My child might have special needs. Where would I find it? So we've built up over the years this inordinate amount of resources across the country. Kind of where it started, and it's evolved along the way.
Right. So you were also saying that the need for face-to-face counseling arose exactly as a result of the long work on the Lifeline, that people wanted to have face-to-face counseling in English, but did not know where to find it, or actually it wasn't really offered.
So correct. So out of that need on the Lifeline, we were catching people, we were finding them, we were trying to support them, but we were struggling with resources to connect them to. Right? And here in Japan, how counseling and, if you like, psychological training happens here, that registration or that licensing body that would give us sort of a criteria of understanding levels or experience, maybe in where I come from in Australia or in the US or the UK, doesn't exist here. And so people could come across and open up a practice and offer therapy, and they may not have had proper credentials, or they might have lost their license and you had no way of knowing. So what we really needed was, where could we send people that we believe were going to be supportive and were going to be doing best practice. So in 1991, we expanded our services to include face-to-face counselling. And so everybody that worked at TELL Counselling was fully licensed and accredited in a program in their with their licensure in their home country. And more important, by being a member of some licensing body, you're required to have ongoing training and supervision. Because if you thought about it, the way that we were treating many conditions 30 years ago to how we're treating them and our understanding of them now, it's significantly different. So that understanding and that keeping up to date on current theories and practices is really important, and something that we take very seriously and we pride ourselves on with the clinic.
Right. So you're saying that basically you wanted to refer people to services that you could assure, and then that you could assure them on the quality of it, that
Yes.
It's not just anybody off the street opening a clinic, but it's actually people who really have the qualifications and the proper training to address the needs.
Correct.
And you also said that TELL has actually expanded its services beyond mental health, well, beyond face-to-face counseling and Lifeline, into actively being involved with the families in schools that have students with special needs, and that you're trying to publicize the sexual assault and rape issues, make some noise on the LGBTQ issues as well.
Right, so a lot of those come out of our overriding goal, which is where the Lifeline started, to address suicide in Japan. So what we wanted to do was look at those at-risk populations and were there suitable services and supports for them. So we know that the LGBTQ community is very vulnerable. We know that children with learning disabilities and developmental needs are very vulnerable. We know that women who are raped and sexually assaulted, or men, either anybody that's raped or sexually assaulted, is very vulnerable. We know that people in domestic violence situations are very vulnerable. So we wanted to offer support programs to these individuals, or at least create some awareness about it.
So basically, sorry,
I was also going to say, we also know that foreigners, when they move around, they are particularly vulnerable. So getting that awareness into the schools and into places where foreigners were was really important. And when you think about it, we know that over 50% of mental health problems occur before someone's 14 years of age, and 75% by the time that they're 24. So getting families and getting young people and helping to support them in those early phases is really important, so that they can be treated effectively and not go on and think poorly of themselves or struggle and become vulnerable. So that, I was going to say, sorry, that we call outreach, right? And I think that's what makes TELL very unique, right? That you might have these services in other parts of the world, but here in Japan, to find a service where you're doing that crisis intervention, where you're doing that face-to-face intervention with someone, or where you're doing that outreach preventative work, is really difficult to find or non-existent here.
So what you're saying is that TELL has started, by helping the international community find information, get some help with mental health, but eventually you realize that there's limits to what the Lifeline can do on its own, and that you have to actually go back to beginning, before the problems happen, or when they happen, that you address them in the beginning when they're still not as so snowballed into bigger issues. I was really curious about what you said, that foreigners, when they move around, that they're very vulnerable, and that you say that mental health issues happen. 75% of it happens before they're 24, but a lot of the foreigners who move to Japan as adults are probably older than 24, and if they have mental health issues and they're foreigners who move around, they're probably doubly vulnerable too. So
Absolutely.
can you tell us more about that?
Okay. So it's not just in Japan where there's not good awareness of mental health issues. If you go back 10, 20 years, it's everywhere, right? So when a foreigner moves to a new country, there are a lot of stresses. They might have been coming across here initially thinking this is going to be fantastic. I'm going to have this great time. I'm going to, I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to teach people about my country or help them with English, and we're going to have this wonderful connection, right? And then they come here and there's the reality of maybe the work that they can do. They're not taking, they hadn't really considered some of the cultural expectations or of the local Japanese, and maybe the Japanese community are not as, oh, that's wonderful, come and tell us about your foreign ways, right? So, well, those expectations that are different can come crashing down on them. And then if they don't have those supports around them, they become very vulnerable. Many, if you like, there's a large number of foreigners that come across on these, if you like, exchange programs, whether they're a university student or whether they're an English language instructor. They end up in rural areas that very limited resources are available for them in a foreign language. And if they don't have those friends and family members around them, then that makes them extremely vulnerable. How would they find out about information that are available to them in their own language, if they even exist? How would they link to services? So typically they'll end up trying to figure out or cope with it themselves. And a lot of the time, if you thought about it, a lot of us don't have the most productive, healthy coping strategies, right? And that can leave them spiraling.
And that's where you would like TELL to step in to help them have more productive strategies of coping.
Or to at least know that we exist and that we can try to link them into supports and resources, and that they're not alone.
So what you're saying about the foreign experience was also turned into a comic on your website under Tell Stories Japan.
Right.
I really love these comics because they really depict the Japanese experience in Japan as a foreigner from many different angles. And I think, often these painful aspects of the experiences are depicted in quite a realistic way. So can you tell us how did idea for that come about?
Right. So we've got some really talented artists that have worked with that. Some have been in the country, and some have lived here and gone back to their own countries and drawn some of the works for us. What we wanted to do was we wanted to bring alive some of the people that call to the Lifeline and tell their stories. We had asked many people that had called the line or put out requests for that, would they be willing to talk about or share their experiences? But the stigma of mental health here is so great, and that's a big request or ask of these people that are already feeling vulnerable, who feel that their job might be threatened by it, or that people will look down on them. So what we did was we reached out to some artists who helped us to sort of bring some of those, if you like, a combination of numerous people on a theme that have called the line over the years, and sort of help tell some of those situations, help bring the people alive, if you like. Help the community get to know some of our users.
So how did those stories actually form? Because, they feel very relatable in many ways, coming to Japan, experiencing certain things like being a teacher in Japan or starting work in a Japanese office after you had a lot of experience abroad first as a Japanese person too. So where did the basis of these stories come from?
So every year we have to report statistics to the government on types of calls that we get, categories of calls, an estimation of the gender, their occupations, those sorts of things. And so there's sort of that history of those sort of categories of callers that might call the line, like a combination of years of that JET teacher or that ALT person that's in some of the rural areas. Right? So it's not one individual, but a history of those types of common situations that occur.
So it's basically like a story, like one story that came out of many people's experiences.
Yes. On a theme, if you like, an amalgamation of everybody that was kind of called on that theme.
I think it just feels like a really wonderful set of works. And you're also, well, the Tell Stories is not just to publicize the experience itself, but it also has a purpose of helping Tell itself as an organization.
Correct. So we have struggled in the last few years with funding, and part of the reason that we were struggling was that people want people want to see that face. People want to see the connection. They want to feel who it is that they're supporting. And because the people that call the Lifeline are anonymous and confidential, and obviously somebody that's doing face-to-face counselling is probably not going to parade their face all over it because they're struggling at that point. How could we let people know who are our people, right? Who could you know, how could you make that connection? And so that's where the artists with their stories have helped us, and trying to get people to connect with them and donate. It also enabled the artists to support us and contribute and feel connected and find a community. So it's helped in lots of different ways.
I love that you're involving the international community in many different levels. So you're saying that if people wanted to contribute to TELL, they could do it through many different ways, not just, well, they could do it as a telephone support worker on the Lifeline itself, but also as an artist, or perhaps through other ways by using the skills that they already have.
So I think, as I said earlier, I'm one of many people that makes this organization exist, and primarily we run off donations and supports and volunteers. And so there's people that can help us in lots of different ways, people that can offer services to help us because of that funding crunch that we have here, people that can help us with information in other areas that are not Tokyo. So if you like, while we've been around in Tokyo for 45 years, and our mission has always been to serve the foreign population, really a lot of our history and a lot of our resources is Tokyo-based, if you like, Kanto-based. And following the earthquake, when we, the large one in Tohoku, in 2011, we lost a lot of our volunteers, and we had to rethink about how could we find our volunteer base. But also what we learned was there were so many foreigners that were struggling in many areas across the country that needed that support. They didn't have accurate information when the disaster went down. They were very, very vulnerable, and that meant that many of them left the country rather than having that ability to stay here. So if we can have better access to services and supports, your foreigners will thrive. So what we have done in that time is been thinking about different ways to evolve our service, from developing online training programs to opening up a satellite phone room in Osaka, which has meant that we could then have information that we could gather from the Kansai region and the Chubo region that would help foreigners in those areas. And in 2017, we expanded again to provide a chat service. And that means with the chat, unlike a phone room service, if we were to maintain confidentiality, I really need to have people come into a location where we can secure the line. Because if we were offering the service in people's home, it's really difficult to stop another call from coming through, or, you know, if somebody comes to the door, or so many other things that would make confidentiality challenging. But when you offer chat, those things, you don't hear those background noises, right? You can remove those from the arena, and the platforms can land on someone's computer temporarily, and all the data is stored in the clouds, and it doesn't stay there. So you can maintain anonymity and confidentiality well, but somebody could still work in their own home. So that allowed us to expand the hours of service, but also recruit volunteers from anywhere around the country. So we went from the low 80s in 2011, 2012 with our volunteers to now around 110, 115 volunteers working on the line. Over the last few years, we've increased that number, and we're continuing to increase that number. So this allows volunteers from many areas that are foreign to connect with us. It allows us to build up that database. It allows us to, and in those areas, like let's say in Kansai, we have people that do pub quizzes for us. We have people that do band nights, people that do yoga clubs or yoga workshops. So, you know, that community just grows. People that do pride walks with us. So it's not just in Tokyo. The volunteers help us in many, many different ways, letting awareness and creating communities, as well as information and resources.
So it really does sound like you're trying to involve many people from different parts of life and Japan. But still, the focus for now is, well, if people want to meet face-to-face with people, then the focus would still be in Tokyo and the larger Kansai urban area. But if people wanted to get involved from rural Japan, would it be a possibility for them to join the training or become the chat support worker so that they could actually do it from their home and not have to commute into Tokyo?
Correct. So that's why I was saying that they could do it from anywhere. So we do have people that are in areas further afield. So, you know, you have the potential to have somebody from Amori to Kyushu to even Okinawa. And when you have a few people in those areas, they, just like they did in Kansai, they can come together and they can start to create those communities, right, where they can meet face to face. While they might initially start doing it in their own homes by themselves, by connecting them together, they can start to build those little communities where they might have their little get-togethers, and one of them might be able to do yoga, one might like to do artwork, or one they might like to run a pub quiz. And that's how the little communities evolve and grow.
Oh, that sounds really wonderful. And you're also saying that because now you have chat services available too, and you're moving more towards the 24-hour Lifeline services. You said that you also have a different type of audience reach out through chat as opposed to Lifeline. Who are they?
Right. So they're younger people, right? Again, just like with our idea that we were serving the whole of Japan, when primarily it was really Kanto-based, our idea was that we were always serving people of all age groups. But in reality, on the phone, we struggled, even when we were doing these school awarenesses and even when we were doing bullying programs, to increase the number of young people that were calling the line. And part of that was the technology changes that were happening across that period, in which young people prefer to communicate not necessarily by the phone, but in text formats. So when we started offering the service in 2017 by chat, the large majority of people were 24 and younger.
Mm.
And we started tapping into that 13 to 18 age group a lot more successfully.
Mm.
That's been really encouraging.
And I guess it goes back to your goal of, trying to reach people before the problems snowball, so you can actually, catch them there right at the onset.
Mm. Mm. And the other thing, when we look at the chat, is we can see with the chat that they are calling from right across the country.
Mm.
So it's a different demographic that we were tapping into, as well as the age. So that is supporting both of those missions. We want to support everybody. We certainly want to help them so they're not in that crisis stage. We can connect them and help them. They can hear a friendly voice that's but potentially an English-speaking voice that maybe they've missed, and it can be a service that doesn't matter where they are across the country, they can tap into easier.
Mm. That is really wonderful. And plus with the chat, I guess you don't have to worry about the phone bills because it is just through internet.
Right. If you have access to the internet, then you can do this for free.
Mm. All right. And I guess another one of the topics that often come up when it comes to mental health in Japan is suicide. And I know that Lifeline is not just for suicide, but for a variety of purposes, like information getting, so people can call you regardless of their issues. So they could just call for information, but they could also have some more serious counseling for extremely difficult situations, or if they're feeling suicidal, or if they're suffering from any other type of issues too. Sorry.
Yes, but primarily the Lifeline started, and all the Lifelines started, to prevent suicides, right? So that's their ultimate goal.
Yes. Okay, so when people call the Lifeline, I guess maybe some people would be curious, what would be the typical process? Like, they call the Lifeline, and then what happens?
Well, I guess it depends on the issue that they're calling about. If they're in an emergency situation, we would have protocols for that. If they're thinking of killing themselves, we would have some protocols and safety issues that we would go through with them, and talking to them about some of those struggles. If they've been in a situation of domestic violence situation, or rape or sexual assault, we'd have protocols around them. Same with child abuse. So I guess it would depend on the situation. Primarily, we're going to be listening to them. We're going to be offering client-centered counselling. That's the type of support that we offer on our Lifeline, with that notion of we want to try and empower the user to find and explore ways of coping themselves in the future. But also we are going to be connecting with them on that human level. We're going to be trying to connect with them and have that empathy and understanding. So I think that really that meaningful connection is what a lot of them are missing. Many of them are struggling, they're alone, they're isolated, they feel they're failing, and having someone care about them and hear them, someone that's going to be non-judgmental, and is truly trying to understand and support them, is really, really valuable. So I guess there's no typical call. It's going to be different on every situation and depending on the topic. But underneath it is always going to be that wanting to have that empathy and that caring and support for that individual.
And that's basically the philosophy of client-centered counseling, in which basically whoever's doing the counseling is not passing judgments, and it's not about trying to give advice, but it's about, as you said, empowering people and showing empathy for the person in need in front of them.
Correct. We don't want To create a dependency with if we're always giving advice, that's all about the individual feeling powerful, right? The person giving advice feels powerful then, right? We don't want to do that. We want to help that individual that's struggling feel that they can manage things in their lives. And they have already done that by reaching out and calling a line, right? And for many of them, they're struggling with mental health issues where they're already feeling like they're a failure. But and that's part of the message that we want to change, right? So if you had the flu or you had cancer or you had even diabetes, you're
Mm-hmm.
possibly not feeling like you're a failure because you've got these, right? You might be grieving, you might be angry, you might be upset about it, but you're not feeling somehow you failed because you got these. When you have a
Mm,
mental health problem, many people feel that they failed simply because they have a mental health problem. And they haven't failed any more than you failed with any of those other conditions. So
mm,
creating that empathy, creating that caring, and that trying to empower them is really important because they haven't failed, right? They have an illness and they need support. And they've reached out to the line, and that's so powerful.
mm. It does sound truly empowering to get that support and encouragement when we feel at our worst.
Mm.
But people don't need to feel at their worst to call the Lifeline. Is that correct?
Absolutely, you could call about anything. Could be feeling lonely, and as I mentioned, all of the um, information reasons you could call about. You could be having relationship issues. You could be
Mm.
stressed about things at work. It could be so varied, anything and everything. You could be lost. Could have lost your wallet. Uh, so many things.
All right. So basically,
Absolutely, and
it's like an all-around support and sort of like a friend who
yes,
you probably never met, but it's there for you.
absolutely.
All right, that sounds really lovely. And I'd like to go back to what you said about, misconceptions about mental health. And there's often, so whenever I talk about Japan, I often get asked about suicides or about bullying in Japan because it's always in the news when it comes to news about Japan abroad.
Hmm.
Um, so can you tell us more about suicides in Japan? You often say that there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of, well, incorrect facts floating around surrounding the suicides in this country.
Right. It has got better. When I started doing my research in suicides in Japan around 2006, if
Mm-hmm.
I went out and gave a talk in the community about some of the interventions that the Japanese government was trying to do and some of the areas where they'd had some success, I would get booed. Right? People would
Mm.
not want to talk to me. People would actually get angry with me
Really?
because they wanted to believe it's that samurai way. No one wanted to believe that it's a mental health problem. No one wanted to talk about that. And nobody even wanted to hear about some of the areas where the Japanese society has had some successes. Now, we're 2018 now, and attitudes have changed, and some awareness has improved, but I still regularly get people coming across and being fascinated by suicides in Japan and being fascinated by that samurai way. And I can't think of it. Was it Logan Paul or whatever? Is that the YouTuber that came across beginning of
Oh,
last year and went to the Agigohara and the Sea of Trees, right? So
yeah.
it's still going on, right? At least when he came across and did his video, there was some backlash about it. So I just like to clarify right now: people die from a mental health condition, um, typically a mood disorder, and that is why they end up taking their lives, an untreated mental health condition. It is not because it's the samurai way. If that was the case, the suicide rate would always have been high in Japan. Japan's suicide rate has gone up and down depending over hundreds of years, depending on stresses that were going on in the community or in the society at the time. The reason why it spiked in the 1990s was because following World War II, um, when the country was redefining itself and many businesses and factories and companies started up in Japan, people got lifetime employment. They wanted to rebuild their society. They wanted to have that pride in their country again. And for many of the men, they went into these companies with the promise that they would have lifetime employment. And for the women, they took on, if you like, that American role, if you like, that we're going to stay home and we're going to be the housewives and look after the family and look after the children. And they take their roles in Japan very seriously, right? And that's something to feel proud about, taking on those roles well. But when you hit that economic downturn in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, companies struggled. They couldn't maintain, they either went bankrupt or they couldn't keep all of these people in the workplace, and these men lost their lifetime employment. Now, these men at that time had believed wholeheartedly, their expectation was, this is my role. My role is to be the breadwinner. My role is to contribute money to my family. This is my role. This is my purpose. When thousands of them lost their jobs, they really crashed. For many of them, they didn't feel, they didn't know what to do or how to fit back into their families. They felt that they had failed. They didn't have a lot of hobbies and other things that they were connected to. And so they got very depressed. And they felt at that time, when there was no discussion about depression, that if they got a payout on their life insurance policies, this would be better for their family. But a payout on their life insurance policy didn't replace the individual, and financially wasn't even going to be sustainable for the families. But it was, their thinking at the time wasn't productive. Their thinking at the time was, I'm depressed and I'm a failure and I've let my family down. This will help them. They'll be better off without me. But in turn, they weren't better off without them, right? Because what we do know is that if you've had a suicide in your family, the stigma and the shame of that and the misunderstanding that goes with it, typically 25% of those close to that individual will go on and take their lives. So that is not what that individual ever wanted.
25%.
Right? Yes, 25%.
That's a lot.
Right. So you think about that over the generations, right? You've got all these fathers that were taking their lives, and the stress that they put on the families, the stress it put on the mothers, the stress it put on the children. And so you had this vulnerable population that have now grown up who are at risk. So that is what happened, not a samurai way, right? It's economic factors. The other big thing is that Japan has an aging population with a higher percentage in that aging population than many other countries. Now, other countries are catching up to us, but what we do know is worldwide, it's the elderly that take their lives in larger numbers than any other age group. Now, what was also happening at that time around the turn of the century is that that breakup of the extended family was happening, and you had more people that were working, that left their rural areas, they come back down into these cities like Tokyo or Osaka, and their elderly parents were left in those rural areas. And so that made the elderly people that were left there feel like, well, I don't want to be a burden to my family. I don't want to be a failure. And they got very depressed. So you're seeing that happen in many other countries. So despite us extending life expectancies, if we don't make people's quality of life better, if we don't make people's meaning of life better, people will get depressed. And with that, suicidal thoughts are common. And if they're not getting treatment, if people don't understand it, then what is there to prevent that? Now, Japan has done some really great things to address that, trying to change that dialogue, trying to educate doctors about depression, trying to extend or delay the outpay on insurance policies, which has meant that a lot of the men in those categories have stopped taking their lives, and also offering some really innovative, if you like, packages to get out of financial debt
Mm.
that has really helped see that number come down. It's also done some really creative things in the rural communities to address the elderly population. But when we talk about suicide prevention, every age category and every demographic has a different set of issues that you have to look at, right? So there's not a one fits all strategy that we could roll out that would affect everybody. If I'm a young person and I'm being bullied in the school, I'm going to need something. I'm not going to need those financial packages. They're not going to help me, right?
Yeah.
I need diversity and awareness training and changing attitudes on LGBTQI issues, right? I need services to support me. So, it's an awareness of all of those risk groups, right? And changing our attitude and putting services in place.
Mm. So it sounds like it's a mixture of, individual factors, societal factors, and
Mm.
the practical realities that people live in.
Mm-hmm.
So now you've described as the societal, suicide at the societal level. How does it look like at the individual level? I remember once when I heard you talk, you were saying that suicide is basically a long process, but kind of like an endpoint of a long process of problem solving that did not work out. Can you tell us more about that?
So one of the ways that I like to sort of think about it is, you don't go from, if you like, being mentally healthy
Mm,
to taking your life uh,
mm,
overnight. Though there are some situations where that could happen, but that would be extremes, right?
mm,
More often than not, what is going to happen is going to be this gradual progression where you're going downhill and you're getting sicker and sicker and sicker, right? So a good analogy or way to think about that is if I had a cold, right, and I don't look after it and I don't take care of myself, I can get an infection. And if I don't look after that infection, I could end up with something like bronchitis, right?
mm,
And if I'm not looking after myself and I don't go to the doctor and I think that I should be able to think my way out of the bronchitis, it should just get better, and I don't even take painkillers, I'm going to get sicker and sicker. I'm not going to sleep well. I'm going to be coughing all the time. It's going to exhaust me even more. Um, you know, so if I don't manage that, I'm going to get pneumonia. And if I
mm,
don't manage the pneumonia, I'm going to end up dying. Okay.
yeah.
And many people can go down that path and die from pneumonia and not managing chest infections. Um, but we don't have this whole, if you like, research in how someone dies from pneumonia, but we're fascinated with how someone dies from a mental health problem, right? The same thing happens. If I don't look after my mental health, I'm going to get sicker. And the pain is going to be more intolerable. It's going to be more exhausting. It's going to be more debilitating, to the point that I can't think properly, to the point that I think I'm a failure, to it's just exhausting, to the
Mm,
point I feel like I'm such a burden, I don't want to be here anymore and I can't do this anymore. There's a
mm,
really interesting study that came out of Harvard University in 2016 that talks about the impact of disability from somebody with moderate and severe depression. And they equate the disability burden equivalent from a moderate depression from someone who is recovering from a severe bout of multiple sclerosis. And for someone who is suffering with severe depression, equivalent to a severe, to being quadriplegic, right? Yet every day, people with severe depression somehow try to manage to do their day-to-day activities, right? And we think that our society image of these people is, come on, you're not trying hard enough. Come on, get on with it. We would not do that to the person with diabetes. We would not do that to the person with cancer. We would not do that to all of these other health problems, but we do it with mental health all the time.
mm,
So how are we expecting a person with a cognitive disorder or a cognitive illness to think their way out of it? When you think about it like that, it's almost like we've got the block, right? The people who are well have the block, right? Why do we think that someone who is sick could think their way out of this when we wouldn't think that of someone with cancer, or we wouldn't think that of someone with diabetes?
Right.
So these people die alone, they die feeling a failure, and yet it's us that's failed them.
Right. I guess like when it comes to cancer or diabetes, often people think, there's a concrete physical correlate that they could actually look at. Like, there's a concrete thing you can actually find on like radiography or scans. But when it comes to things like feeling worthless or feeling like you're a burden to other people, often in people's minds, this is not a concrete concept, but a very abstract one. And I feel like for many of us, it's really hard to conceptualize, this gradation of the intensity of feelings that people have around these things.
So you can't see pain in someone's brain, yet we treat it all the time for many other illnesses. You can't see pain on a broken leg, right? You can't see pain on cuts in a body, but we recognize it and we acknowledge it. You can't find multiple sclerosis in your body. You can't find many conditions that we struggle to diagnose properly. You can see the physical things of mood disorders. You can see changes in the brain from the anxieties, right? You've got to look at it differently. So there are physical things here. That doesn't mean to say that you can't see it on a scan, or you can't see it and diagnose it. It's just as real. And pain that is associated with it is just as real.
So you're saying that here, those, I guess, healthy people should actually have a better understanding of issues surrounding mental health, surrounding these emotional situations, and actually accept it as a valid experience on their own.
Absolutely. And that is, and maybe this is a nice place to kind of end this session on, that is that stigma and why the outreach grew out of our services. Stigma right around the world is killing people, right? Our ignorance and our misunderstanding of mental illness is costing lives all around the world. In Japan, the stigma associated with mental health issues is greater than many other countries. In many other Asian countries, it's greater. But right around the world, we haven't got this right. Right around the world, our understanding, our support, our tolerance, our acceptance of a person with a mental health problem is poor. And if 1 in 4 of us are to experience in our lifetime, that's pretty bad of society that we are not getting this right. I mentioned this in many discussions that I have. With all the knowledge that is out there, how are we so wrong? It's like we all believe that the world is flat when it's round, right? Mental health problems are real. They're not something to snap out of. They need support and treatment, and they need understanding and care. And as I said, they are dying in their thousands because of our lack of connection and our lack of understanding and our lack of support.
And that's why you basically say that suicide is the most preventable cause of death.
Correct. And zero suicides are possible.
So you say that in order for people to get help, well, basically, we as a community could help those in need to get the support they need by maybe talking to the Lifeline, a counselor, a GP, or a psychiatrist. But I was also wondering if there's any way we can help each other too.
You can learn about stigma. You can learn about what you can do to break it down. You can learn to create awareness. You can learn about mental health problems and issues and what they look like. Just like we know what a cold looks like or the flu and how to treat that, right? You need to learn about mental health. You all have it. We all have it. We have healthy mental health, and we can struggle with it at times, right? Learning to manage that, learning to understand it, learning to cope with it is something we all need to do, just for ourselves, for others around us, and particularly for our parents. With a large number that happens when they're young, it's something we all need to understand.
And perhaps another thing that we could also do is, like you say, maybe learn how to be better listeners to people in need. Like the Lifeline supports people through the client-centered counseling. Listening is a skill we can all will apply, but we often don't.
That will make us better people in the workplace. It will make us better family members. It will make us better friends. It will make us better people in general. And that can't be a bad thing.
All right. So finally, how can people get in touch with TELL? What is the best way to reach out to TELL if we wanted to get involved?
You could visit our website, which is telljp.com, and that has all of the various sources. You can call our Lifeline if you're looking for that sort of support. You can email us for volunteer activities. You can call the clinic directly, or you can email our outreach coordinator. It's all available on our website, and please reach out to us. We're here for you.
And you are also posting links to the events regularly through your Facebook website, Facebook site.
Social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, yes.
All right. Thank you so much. I will be posting the links to everything we mentioned today and the number of the TELL Lifeline and TELL office in the comments. And thank you so much again, Vickie, for coming. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Dora, and I hope people continue to thrive out there.
Yes, me too. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.